Stay with me. Because what happened in that room didn't just end a marriage, it exposed a lie worth millions. The sound came first, not loud, not violent, but sharp enough to slice through the polished silence of the Blackwood Tower executive floor, the kind of silence built on money, power, and secrets nobody dared to question. And in that single moment, Emily Carter stopped breathing, her hand instinctively resting over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy, as if her body already knew something was about to break. Not glass, not furniture, but the fragile illusion she had been living inside for 3 years, because just 10 feet away, reflected in the darkened glass wall of Richard Blackwood's private office, stood her husband, the billionaire so everyone admired, his tailored charcoal suit perfect as always, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in months, and beside him, too close, far too close, stood Vanessa Cole, her heels clicking softly against marble as she leaned in with a familiarity that didn't belong to an employee, not to a colleague, but to someone who had already crossed a line Emily hadn't even known existed. And for a second, just a second, Emily told herself she was mistaken, that there had to be another explanation, something logical, something that wouldn't rewrite every late night, every missed dinner, every cold, "I'm busy," text into something far uglier. But then Vanessa laughed, low and confident, the kind of laugh that didn't ask for permission. And Richard didn't step away, didn't correct the distance, didn't even look surprised. Instead, his reflection shifted closer, his hand brushing Vanessa's wrist in a gesture so small it could have been missed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Emily saw it. She saw everything. And something inside her chest tightened, not pain, not yet, but pressure, like the moment before a storm finally breaks, and suddenly the hallway felt too bright, too exposed. Every fluorescent light humming overhead like it was watching her unravel in real time. She took a step back, her flats barely making a sound against the floor, but her heart was loud, too loud, pounding in her ears like a warning she had ignored for too long. Because this wasn't just a moment. This was a pattern, a series of small dismissals and quiet absences stacking into something undeniable. And for the first time, Emily didn't feel confused. She felt clear, terrifyingly clear, as if every piece of the last year had snapped into place at once. The canceled vacations, the sudden business trips, the way Richard had started locking his phone, the way he stopped asking about the baby unless someone else was around. It wasn't distance, it was design, and that realization settled over her like cold air, steady, controlled, irreversible. She didn't cry. Not here, not in a hallway lined with glass offices and people who measured worth in quarterly reports. Instead, she turned, slowly, deliberately, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach, grounding herself in the one truth that hadn't changed. And as she walked toward the elevator, the doors reflecting her pale expression back at her, she understood something she hadn't been ready to face before. This wasn't just betrayal. It was preparation, and somewhere behind her, in that office filled with polished steel and quiet deception, a story was being written about her without her consent, a story where she was weak, disposable, easy to erase. And as the elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing her away from the life she thought she knew, Emily Carter made one silent decision that would change everything. She would not be erased. The elevator descended in silence, each passing floor marked by a soft digital chime that felt louder than it should have, as if the building itself was counting down to something Emily could not yet name. Her reflection in the brushed steel doors steady but unfamiliar, the composed face of a woman who had just watched her life split into before and after without a single word being spoken. And still she did not cry. Not when the doors opened into the marble lobby. Not when the receptionist greeted her with the same polite smile as always. Not even when she stepped out into the late afternoon air where the city moved on without noticing that something irreversible had just taken place on the 32nd floor. Instead, she walked, one step after another, her hand resting protectively over her stomach as if the small, quiet movements beneath her palm were the only rhythm she could trust. Because everything else now felt rehearsed, staged, controlled by someone else. And that realization followed her all the way to her car, where she sat for a moment with the engine off, the world muted behind tinted glass. replaying every detail with a clarity that was almost surgical. The late meetings that stretched past midnight, the canceled doctor appointments he had promised to attend, the way he had started referring to the baby as a future obligation instead of a present reality. And suddenly those moments were no longer isolated disappointments. They were evidence, carefully arranged pieces of a pattern she had been too loyal to question, too hopeful to challenge. And as the truth settled into place, another thought surfaced, quieter but sharper, because this was not just about betrayal. It was about timing, about decisions being made without her, about plans that required her to remain exactly as she had been, trusting, patient, uninformed. And that meant one thing: there was more she had not seen yet, more she had not been meant to see at all, and the idea did not scare her the way it should have. Instead, it steadied her, because uncertainty could be investigated, silence could be broken. And for the first time in a long time, Emily did not feel like she was reacting. She felt like she was observing, stepping outside the version of herself that had waited and believed and excused, and into something quieter, something more precise. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against her phone, hesitating for just a second before she unlocked it, not to call Richard, not to send a message that would be ignored or dismissed, but to scroll, to search, to revisit the details she had overlooked before. And there it was, small at first, almost insignificant, a transfer notification she had seen weeks ago and dismissed as routine business. Except now it did not look routine, not when paired with the new image of that office, that closeness, that unspoken alliance. The numbers were large, larger than anything she had ever been involved in. And they were recent, too recent to be coincidence. Her breath slowed as she studied the screen, her mind shifting from emotion to calculation, because this was no longer just a personal betrayal. It was structural, deliberate. And as the realization took hold, something inside her settled into place. Not anger, not fear, but resolve. The kind that does not need to announce itself, because it already knows what comes next. And as Emily Carter finally started the engine and pulled into the evening traffic, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever story had been written about her without her knowledge was about to change, and this time, she would be the one holding the pen. By the time Emily reached home, the sky had already shifted into that muted blue of early evening, the kind that made everything look calm even when it was not. And she welcomed the stillness of the house not as comfort, but as space. Because for the first time in months, she needed silence that belonged to her, not the curated quiet of a penthouse where every detail had been chosen to impress, but this, a modest place where nothing was hidden behind glass or reputation. She set her bag down, carefully, her movements deliberate, controlled, as if any sudden action might disrupt the fragile clarity she had just found. And for a moment she stood there, one hand resting on the kitchen counter, the other still over her stomach, feeling the steady presence of the life depending on her. A quiet reminder that whatever came next would not just be about her anymore. It would be about protection, about truth, about making sure that what was being built behind her back did not become something her child would have to inherit. And that thought sharpened everything. Because suddenly this was not about emotion. It was about responsibility. She moved toward the dining table, pulling out a chair and sitting down slowly, her phone already in her hand. The earlier transfer still open on the screen, but now she was looking deeper, scrolling further, connecting dates, amounts, names, and each new detail did not confuse her. It confirmed something she had already begun to understand. This was not random. It was structured, the kind of structure that required planning, intention, and above all, confidence that no one would question it, especially not her. And that realization carried a weight heavier than any single betrayal, because it meant she had been underestimated, not just as a wife, but as a person capable of seeing, of understanding, of responding, and for a brief second, a flicker of something old tried to surface: doubt, the instinct to rationalize, to give him the benefit of explanation. But it faded quickly, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, because the evidence did not ask for interpretation, it simply existed. And as she continued tracing the pattern, another name appeared, one she recognized immediately: Vanessa Cole, not just in proximity, but directly tied to a series of financial movements that had no clear business justification. Her breath slowed, not from fear, but from focus, because now the lines were no longer blurred. They were connected, personal and professional, crossing in a way that was not accidental. And that changed everything, because whatever Richard was building was not just a relationship, it was a strategy, and Emily was positioned outside of it by design. And that realization did not break her. It steadied her further. She leaned back slightly, her gaze lifting from the screen to the quiet room around her, taking in the simplicity of it, the absence of performance. And in that moment, she understood something that would have terrified her just days ago. She was no longer inside his world, and that meant she was no longer bound by it. She could observe without being controlled. She could act without asking permission. And most importantly, she could prepare. And as that thought settled in, her phone vibrated softly in her hand. A message lighting up the screen, Richard's name appearing with a simple line, asking where she was, as if nothing had changed, as if the version of her that would respond immediately was still there. And Emily stared at it for a second longer than necessary, not with hesitation, but with recognition, because this was the moment where the old pattern would expect her to return, to explain, to reassure, to stay within the role that had been written for her. But instead, she did something small, almost invisible. She locked the screen, set the phone down, and let the silence answer for her. And in that silence, something shifted completely, because for the first time, she was not reacting to his world. She was stepping outside of it and preparing to build her own response, one that would not be rushed, not emotional, not predictable, but precise. And as Emily Carter sat there in the quiet, her hand resting protectively over her child, she understood that whatever came next would not be about confrontation. It would be about control, and this time, she would not be the one losing it. The house remained quiet long after the message disappeared from her screen, the kind of silence that did not press against her but settled around her like something earned. And Emily stayed at the table a few moments longer, letting the stillness stretch just enough for her thoughts to align, because clarity without action was just another form of waiting, and she had already spent too much time waiting. Slowly she reached for her phone again, not to respond, not to explain, but to document, her fingers moving with a precision that felt unfamiliar and yet completely natural, as if this version of her had always existed beneath the surface, simply waiting for the moment when she would finally stop asking for permission to see what was in front of her. She opened a new folder, labeled it with nothing that would draw attention, and began saving everything: the transfers, the dates, the names, screenshots organized not by emotion but by sequence, building something quiet and structured that no one else could erase with a conversation or a denial, because she understood now that words could be manipulated, but records could not. And as each file settled into place, something inside her shifted further, not anger, not even disappointment anymore, but distance, the kind that allows you to look at a situation without being consumed by it. And from that distance, she saw something else, something she had missed before, a timeline that extended beyond the past few months, reaching further back into moments she had once dismissed as coincidence. The sudden restructuring of accounts shortly after their anniversary, the new legal firm Richard had quietly brought in under the explanation of expansion, the subtle change in how decisions were made, as if her presence had slowly been reduced from partner to observer without her ever being formally removed. And that realization did not shock her. It confirmed what she already suspected. This had been planned, not impulsive, not emotional, but strategic, and that meant there were steps ahead she had not yet seen. Moves already set in motion that would only make sense once they were too far along to stop, unless someone intervened before that point. And for the first time, Emily considered what intervention might look like, not confrontation, not an argument that would give him time to adjust, but preparation, quiet and deliberate. Because if this was a structure, then it could be studied. And if it could be studied, it could be understood. And if it could be understood, it could be challenged, but only if she moved carefully. Because whatever confidence allowed him to act this way was built on the assumption that she would not notice, and that assumption was now her advantage. She leaned back slightly, her hand once again resting over her stomach, grounding herself in the steady rhythm. Beneath her palm, a reminder that time mattered now in a different way, every decision carrying weight beyond herself. And that thought brought a new layer of focus. Because this was no longer about reacting to what had already happened. It was about protecting what was still ahead. Her gaze moved across the room, settling briefly on the small framed photo on the shelf, taken just a year ago, when everything still looked intact from the outside. The kind of image people trusted without questioning. And for a second, she studied it not with nostalgia, but with understanding, because now she could see the distance that had already begun even then. The subtle shift she had felt but could not name, and instead of sadness, it gave her something else, confirmation that what she was doing now was not sudden. It was overdue. Her phone lit up again, another message from Richard, this time shorter, more direct, asking if everything was all right, and Emily glanced at it without picking it up, because the question itself carried its own answer. Everything was not all right, but not in the way he believed. Not in a way that could be fixed with reassurance or dismissed with an excuse. Something fundamental had changed, and he did not know it yet. And as she sat there in the quiet, the weight of that truth settling firmly into place, Emily Carter allowed herself one final moment of stillness before moving forward. Because from this point on, every step she took would be intentional, and every silence she kept would be strategic. And somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet house, a plan was already unfolding, but this time, it would not go unchallenged. The night settled deeper around the house, and with it came a quiet that felt less like absence and more like preparation, as if every second that passed was being measured against something Emily had not yet revealed. She moved through the space slowly, not out of hesitation but intention, her fingertips brushing lightly against surfaces she had once decorated with care, now seeing them not as pieces of a shared life, but as markers of a chapter that had already begun to close. And when she reached the bedroom, she paused, her gaze sweeping across the neatly arranged room where everything appeared unchanged, untouched, as if the truth she had uncovered earlier could not possibly exist within walls that looked this orderly, this composed. But she knew better now, because appearances were part of the structure, and structures were designed to hold until someone applied pressure in the right place. She stepped inside, her movements quiet, controlled, and went directly to the closet, pulling down a small storage box from the top shelf, one she had not opened in months. Inside were documents, personal records, things she had once considered routine, marriage certificates, insurance policies, copies of agreements she had signed without much thought at the time, trusting the process, trusting him. And as she sat on the edge of the bed, opening each file with careful attention, she began to read again, not as a wife, but as someone looking for patterns, for language that had once seemed standard but now carried different weight. And it did not take long for her to notice it: subtle clauses, small adjustments in ownership percentages, revisions dated within the last year, all presented as updates, all signed during moments when she had been distracted, focused on preparing for the baby, trusting that nothing significant would be hidden in something so routine. But now the pattern was clear. These were not updates. They were shifts, quiet movements of control that redefined what belonged to whom. And as the realization settled, her expression did not change, but her focus sharpened, because this confirmed what she had begun to suspect. This was not just about Vanessa, not just about a relationship that crossed boundaries. This was about positioning, about creating a version of the future where Emily would be left with less than she ever realized she had already given. And that understanding did not overwhelm her. It steadied her further, because now she was no longer searching for answers. She was verifying them. She reached for her phone again, opening the folder she had created earlier, adding new images, new notes, building something that was no longer just observation but preparation. And as she worked, the house remained silent. No interruptions, no distractions, just the soft sound of paper and the steady rhythm of her breath, until finally, another sound entered the space, the distant hum of a car pulling into the driveway. And Emily froze for just a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but awareness, because this was earlier than expected. She had calculated more time, but then again, assumptions had never worked in her favor before. She closed the box calmly, returning it to its place, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if nothing had changed, as if she had spent the evening exactly the way he would expect. And when she stood, adjusting her posture slightly, placing one hand over her stomach once more, grounding herself in that steady presence, she understood something important. This moment was not about confrontation, not yet. This was about maintaining the illusion just long enough to gather what she needed, to see how far he had already gone, to understand what he believed she still was. And as the front door opened and footsteps echoed softly through the hallway, Emily Carter turned toward the sound with a calm expression that revealed nothing, because sometimes the most powerful move was not to speak, but to let the other person believe the story they had already written, at least until you were ready to change the ending. The front door closed with a soft, controlled click, the kind that carried no urgency, no visible tension, just routine, and that was what made it more revealing than anything else, because routine meant confidence. It meant Richard Blackwood walked into that house believing everything was still exactly where he had left it, unchanged, unquestioned, and Emily heard his footsteps before she saw him, steady, measured, crossing the hallway with the same authority he carried into boardrooms, into negotiations, into every space where outcomes bent in his favor. And for a moment, she remained still, not hiding, not preparing, simply allowing herself to observe the rhythm of his presence now that she understood it differently. Because earlier that day, she had seen something he did not know she had seen, and that knowledge shifted the entire dynamic in a way he could not yet detect. When he appeared in the doorway, his expression was composed, his tie loosened slightly, his jacket draped over one arm, the image of a man returning from a long day, familiar, almost predictable, and his eyes moved to her immediately, scanning, assessing, but not deeply, not carefully, just enough to confirm that she was there, that the environment remained stable, and then he offered a small, controlled smile, the kind that suggested normalcy without fully engaging in it. "You are home early," he said, his voice even, not questioning, not concerned, simply noting, and Emily met his gaze with the same calm she had practiced only moments before. Her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly over her stomach, grounding herself in that steady presence. "So are you," she replied, her tone neutral, not challenging, not inviting, just balanced, and for a brief second, something flickered across his expression, not suspicion, not yet, but calculation, the kind that registered deviation from expectation without immediately assigning meaning to it. He stepped further into the room, placing his jacket over the back of a chair, his movements deliberate, controlled, and as he did, Emily watched him with a clarity she had never allowed herself before, noticing not what he said, but how he existed within the space, the distance he maintained, the way his attention shifted just slightly away when silence stretched longer than usual, as if he preferred conversations that followed a predictable script, and that realization settled quietly into place. Because she understood now that unpredictability was not something he was prepared for. Not from her. And that made it valuable. "I sent you a message," he added after a moment, his voice carrying a subtle expectation, not of explanation, but of acknowledgement, and Emily allowed a small pause before responding, just enough to register the shift. "I saw it," she said simply, offering no further detail, no apology for the delay, no justification, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was weighted, filled with the absence of the response he had anticipated, and in that absence, something changed, barely visible, but present. His posture adjusted slightly, his gaze holding hers a fraction longer, as if recalibrating, as if searching for the familiar version of her that would smooth over the gap, and when it did not appear, he moved on, subtly redirecting the moment. "Long day," he said, exhaling softly as he loosened his cufflinks, the statement more of a placeholder than a truth. And Emily nodded once, acknowledging without engaging, because she understood. Now that every word exchanged was part of a larger pattern, one she was no longer participating in blindly. And as they stood there in the quiet, the distance between them no longer defined by space but by awareness, Emily Carter realized that this was the beginning of something far more significant than a confrontation. This was the moment where control began to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet spaces where expectations were no longer met, and for the first time, he did not fully understand why. The quiet stretched just a little too long after his last words, and this time Richard did not immediately fill it, which in itself was unusual, because silence had never been something he tolerated without control, and Emily noticed that, not with surprise, but with the kind of calm awareness that came from finally seeing patterns instead of reacting to them. She turned slightly toward the kitchen, her movements unhurried, giving him space to either follow or disengage, and he chose to follow. Just half a step, enough to maintain presence without appearing intentional. "Did you eat?" he asked, the question simple, routine, but his tone carried something else beneath it, a subtle attempt to restore normal rhythm, and Emily paused for a fraction of a second before answering. Not to think, but to choose. "I was not hungry," she said, her voice even, and again she offered nothing more, no elaboration, no invitation. And for a brief moment, the air between them shifted, barely perceptible, but real, because what she was removing was not conversation, it was predictability, and predictability had always been the foundation he relied on. He moved toward the counter, placing his phone down with a soft, deliberate motion, as if signaling that he was present, that this moment required attention, and when he spoke again, his voice was slightly more direct. "You seem quiet," he said, the word chosen carefully, not accusatory, not concerned, but observant, and Emily allowed herself to meet his gaze fully now, steady, composed, her expression unchanged. "It has been a long day," she replied, mirroring his earlier statement with quiet precision. And that was when something shifted more clearly, because reflection, when unexpected, creates imbalance, and for the first time, he did not immediately redirect. Instead, he watched her, searching, measuring, and Emily could almost see the calculation behind his eyes, the attempt to align this version of her with the one he had always known, the one who would soften the edges, who would fill the silence, who would keep everything running smoothly without requiring explanation. But that version was no longer available, not tonight, and not again. He picked up his phone again, almost instinctively, glancing at the screen, and in that brief moment, Emily noticed something she had never paid attention to before, the subtle tension in his shoulders when his attention shifted away, the way his focus fractured when he could not fully control the environment. And it confirmed what she had begun to understand. Control for him was not just preference, it was necessity. And that meant disruption was not just uncomfortable, it was destabilizing. "I have an early meeting tomorrow," he said after a moment, as if closing the conversation before it could move further into unfamiliar territory, and Emily nodded once, acknowledging without engaging, allowing him the exit he was choosing, because she understood now that timing mattered more than reaction. Pushing too soon would only alert him, would give him the chance to adjust, to close whatever gaps she had just begun to uncover. And that was not what she needed, not yet. Instead, she turned slightly, reaching for a glass of water, her movements steady, grounded, maintaining the calm surface that concealed everything beneath it. And as she took a small sip, she felt the subtle movement within her, a reminder of the life that depended on her clarity, her patience, her ability to see beyond the moment. And that grounded her further, because this was no longer about what he had done, it was about what she would do next. And as Richard moved toward the hallway, his presence already beginning to withdraw back into the version of the evening he preferred, Emily Carter stood there in the quiet, her mind no longer racing, no longer searching, but aligning. Because now she knew something he did not. The balance had already begun to shift, and he was still standing in a version of reality that no longer existed. The house grew quieter as the night settled. Deeper, the kind of quiet that carried weight instead of comfort. And Emily remained where she was for a moment longer after Richard disappeared down the hallway, listening not to his footsteps but to the absence of them, because absence now told her more than presence ever had. She moved slowly, turning off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow from the living room lamps, shadows stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines that felt almost deliberate, as if the space itself was shifting with her. And as she walked toward the window, her reflection followed her in the glass, steady, composed, unfamiliar in a way that no longer unsettled her, because she understood now that the person she had been before today had not been incomplete, just unprotected, and that distinction mattered. She rested her hand lightly against the cool surface of the glass, looking out at the dark street beyond. The world continuing without interruption, without awareness, and for the first time, she did not feel small inside that vastness. She felt separate from it, grounded in something that did not require validation, did not depend on someone else's narrative to exist. Her phone remained on the table behind her, silent now. No new messages, no attempts to restore the connection that had quietly fractured, and that silence spoke clearly, because it confirmed what she already knew. He believed the moment had passed, that whatever distance he had sensed could be managed later, reshaped, redirected back into something familiar. But Emily understood something he did not. Some moments do not pass. They shift everything permanently. And once that shift happens, there is no returning to what was, only moving forward with what is now visible. She turned away from the window, her movements calm, deliberate, and walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly outside the bedroom door, not entering, not yet, because that space represented something she was no longer ready to step back into. Without intention, instead she continued past it, moving into the small room she had begun preparing for the baby, a space filled with unfinished details, soft colors, quiet anticipation, and as she stepped inside, the atmosphere changed, lighter, more grounded, as if this room existed outside of everything else that had begun to unravel. She rested her hand over her stomach again, feeling the steady movement beneath her palm, and this time, the sensation did not just ground her, it guided her, because whatever decisions she made from this point forward would shape more than just her own future. They would define the environment her child would grow into, and that thought clarified everything with a precision she could not ignore. This was not about reacting to betrayal. It was about building something stronger in its place, something that could not be quietly altered without her knowledge, something that did not rely on trust that had already been broken. And as she stood there in the soft light of that unfinished room, Emily Carter made a decision that did not require words, did not need to be spoken aloud to become real. She would not confront him tomorrow. She would not demand explanations that could be rewritten. Instead, she would continue exactly as she had begun, observing, collecting, understanding every layer of what had been set in motion, because once she moved, once she revealed what she knew, it would not be to argue, it would be to end something decisively, and that required certainty, not emotion. And as the quiet settled around her once more, no longer heavy but steady, Emily allowed herself a slow breath, her mind no longer searching, no longer questioning, but preparing, because the next time everything shifted, it would not be in silence, and it would not be on his terms. Morning arrived without announcement, just a gradual shift in light that slipped through the curtains and settled quietly across the room. And Emily was already awake, not because she had not slept, but because something inside her had changed the way rest worked. It was no longer escape. It was preparation. She lay still for a moment, one hand resting over her stomach, feeling the slow, steady rhythm beneath her palm, grounding herself before the day began, because today was not about discovery that had already happened. Today was about alignment, about moving forward, without hesitation, without doubt. And when she finally stood, her movements were calm, deliberate, the kind of quiet efficiency that did not draw attention but carried intention in every step. The house was still. Richard had already left, his absence marked only by the faint trace of routine, a cup in the sink, a chair slightly out of place. Small details that once would have felt familiar now simply registered as information. She moved through the kitchen without pause, her phone already in her hand, the folder she had built open, organized, complete enough to show a pattern but not yet finished. And as she reviewed it one more time, her focus did not waver, because she was no longer looking for confirmation. She was verifying readiness. Each document, each transfer, each quiet adjustment forming something larger than any single piece, a structure that could not be explained away with words or dismissed with timing. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the moment when this would shift from preparation to action, not imagined, not emotional, but precise, controlled, undeniable. Her reflection in the dark screen stared back at her, steady, composed, a version of herself that no longer questioned whether she was capable of what came next, because capability was not something she needed to prove anymore. It was something she had already begun to use. She set the phone down carefully, reaching for a glass of water, taking a slow sip as she let the silence settle once more. But this silence was different. It was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was clear, open, waiting, and in that space, Emily Carter made the final decision she had been moving toward since the moment everything shifted. She would not wait for another sign. She would not allow more time for adjustments to be made without her knowledge. She would move forward, but not with confrontation, not with emotion. Instead, with something far more controlled, she would bring everything into the light at once, at a moment where it could not be redirected, where every piece she had gathered would stand on its own, and the truth would not need explanation. It would simply exist, and as that decision settled into place, she reached for her phone again, scrolling to a contact she had not called in months, someone she trusted not because of history, but because of clarity, someone who understood structure, process, and consequence. Her brother, Michael Carter, and for a brief moment, her finger hovered over the screen, not from hesitation, but from recognition, because this call would mark the end of silence, the beginning of something that could not be undone, and then she pressed it, bringing the phone to her ear, listening as it rang once, twice, before his voice came through, steady, grounded, familiar in a way that required no explanation. "Emily," he said, and in that single word, she felt something shift completely into place, not relief, not dependence, but alignment, because now she was no longer standing alone at the edge of what she had uncovered. She was stepping forward with clarity, with support, with purpose, and as she spoke, her voice calm, measured, carrying none of the weight she had once felt, only direction. She understood something with absolute certainty. Whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do now, and this time, the outcome would not be written without her.